There are moments in history that arrive quietly. No explosions, no sirens, no dramatic speeches written for applause. Just a man standing still, choosing his words carefully, fully aware that what he is about to say is not for today, but for memory. This was one of those moments. On an ordinary morning in Burkina Faso, a senior military officer stepped forward to speak. He was not announcing a victory. He was not declaring a new operation. He was expressing gratitude publicly, deliberately, and with visible weight for a responsibility he had just received. A promotion in rank, yes, but far more than that, a confirmation of trust. That trust came from Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of a nation that has lived through years of violence, displacement, and uncertainty. A leader who, according to the speaker, has chosen to give more than orders. He has given his time, his energy, and his youth to a struggle that touches every corner of the country. For nearly 3 years, Burkina Faso has been fighting not only to reclaim territory, but to reclaim dignity. Villages once abandoned have slowly come back to life. Families have returned home. And beyond the battlefield, a different kind of fight has been unfolding, a fight for development, stability, and the simple right of a nation to move forward. What makes this moment striking is not military language but moral clarity. The officer speaking does not present himself as a hero. He calls himself an older man nearing 60. And then he draws a line that feels uncomfortable but honest. He reminds his audience that the one carrying the heaviest burden is not the oldest in the room but the youngest at the top. In a world where leadership is often associated with privilege and distance, this raises a difficult question. What does real sacrifice in leadership actually look like today? And perhaps even more unsettling, can a nation truly move forward if those with experience refuse to stand behind those willing to risk everything? If this story made you pause even briefly, please share it with someone who still believes leadership should mean service, not comfort. And subscribe if you believe the truth about Africa, about Burkina Faso, and about leadership itself goes far deeper than the headlines. The event itself appeared simple on the surface. A senior officer was promoted, new insignia were placed on his shoulders, cameras recorded the moment. Applause followed. In many countries, that would have been the end of the story, a formal ceremony quickly forgotten. But in Burkina Faso, this moment carried a different weight. Standing before his peers, the newly promoted general did not begin with self-congratulation. He began with gratitude, not the polite, rehearsed kind, but the kind that reveals an understanding of responsibility. He thanked the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Ibrahim Traoré, not merely for the rank he had received, but for the trust behind it. That distinction matters, because in times of national crisis, a promotion is not a reward, it is an assignment. The general made this clear immediately. He described the elevation not as a personal achievement, but as a confirmation of confidence, a renewed mandate to carry out a mission that has defined Burkina Faso's recent history. And in the same breath, he called it a reminder that whatever has been done so far is not enough. This was not false modesty. It was realism. For nearly 3 years, the country has lived under pressure. Armed groups have challenged state authority. Entire communities were forced to flee. Maps were redrawn not by law, but by fear. In that context, military leadership is not theoretical. It is measured by whether people can return home. The general acknowledged progress carefully without exaggeration. Territory has been reclaimed. Localities once considered lost have been reopened. Families have gone back to villages they thought they would never see again. These are not abstract achievements. For older Americans who remember wars defined by front lines and homecomings, this language resonates deeply. Yet the most important part of his message came next. He shifted the focus away from the battlefield. The fight, he said, is not limited to combat zones. It is not only about weapons patrols or tactical victories. The struggle being led today is comprehensive, touching every aspect of national life. Security, development, governance, social stability. All of it is part of the same war for survival. In that framework, the role of the president is redefined. Not as a distant figure issuing commands, but as what the general called the first soldier of the nation. Someone engaged not only in military decisions, but in every front where the country must stand or fall. Development projects, national cohesion, the basic conditions that allow a society to function. These are treated not as secondary concerns, but as strategic priorities. The general spoke with the authority of someone who has seen the system from the inside. As a former chief of staff and minister of defense, he did not present himself as an outsider praising leadership from afar. He spoke as someone who understands the scale of the task and its limits. He admitted openly that much of what is being accomplished depends on the personal drive and relentless involvement of the president himself. That admission was striking. In many political systems, such candor would be avoided. Here, it was offered as a call to action. If so much depends on one individual's sacrifice, then the responsibility of everyone else becomes heavier, not lighter. This is why the general's message was not celebratory. It was instructional. He urged those listening officers, officials, citizens to double their efforts, to support, to accompany, and to actively assist the leadership in place, not out of loyalty to a person, but out of duty to a mission that has already demanded too much to fail now. In this first phase of the story, the event is clear. A promotion became a mirror, a ceremony became a warning, and gratitude became a reminder that in Burkina Faso today, authority is inseparable from sacrifice. The emotional peak of the speech did not arrive with statistics or battlefield reports. It arrived with a pause. After acknowledging what had been reclaimed territory villages, the general shifted his tone. His words slowed. His focus narrowed. And what followed was not a military assessment, but a moral reckoning. He spoke about age, about time, about the quiet but irreversible cost of leadership. We are the elders, he admitted, openly referring to himself and others around him. Men nearing 60. Men who have lived most of their lives. And then he drew the contrast that defined the entire moment. The one carrying the heaviest burden today is not among the oldest, but among the youngest. In that single comparison, the ceremony reached its climax. Because in Burkina Faso, the leader being spoken of, Ibrahim Traoré, is not a man approaching the end of his career. He is a man who has placed his youth at the center of a national struggle. A youth that could have been spent elsewhere, a youth that could have been protected. Instead, it has been committed fully to a fight whose outcome is uncertain and whose risks are permanent. The general did not romanticize this sacrifice. He named it for what it is, a loss that cannot be recovered. Youth once given does not return. Time spent under pressure does not rewind. And leadership exercised in crisis leaves marks that no uniform can conceal. By acknowledging this publicly, the speaker did something rare. He removed distance between authority and vulnerability. This acknowledgement carried an implicit message to everyone listening. If the youngest among them is willing to give everything, then what excuse remains for those with experience, rank, or comfort? The reaction embedded in the speech was not applause, but obligation. The general made this explicit when he called on all those present and all those who would later hear his words to increase their efforts. Not symbolically. Not rhetorically, but practically. To support, to assist, and to stand behind the leadership with action rather than observation. This was not a demand for blind loyalty. It was a demand for shared responsibility. He framed the struggle as one that history would judge collectively. Future generations, he said, will remember whether this moment produced visible, tangible results, whether the sacrifices made especially by the young were allowed to bear fruit, or whether they were wasted through hesitation and division. In that sense, the speech reached beyond the room. It spoke to civil servants, community leaders, families, and elders across the country. It challenged them to see themselves not as spectators of national transformation, but as participants whose choices would either reinforce or weaken the path already taken. There was no mention of external enemies in this section. No foreign powers, no international institutions, no outside forces to blame. The focus remained internal. What matters most at this stage, the message implied, is not what the world thinks, but whether the nation itself is willing to honor the sacrifices already made. Whether it is willing to ensure that the energy, commitment, and youth invested in this struggle are not remembered as a tragic chapter, but as a turning point. For an older American audience, this moment resonates deeply. It echoes memories of times when young men and women were sent to carry burdens decided by others. It raises uncomfortable but necessary questions about generational duty, about whether experience is used to protect the future or to retreat from it. The climax of this section is not dramatic. It is sober. It leaves the listener with a sense of moral weight that cannot be dismissed. A realization that leadership, when taken seriously, is not about titles or ceremonies, but about who pays the price and who stands beside them when it matters most. Once the emotional peak passed, the meaning of the speech did not fade. It deepened. What followed was not a declaration of victory, but a clear warning about consequences, civil, political, and historical. The general's words carried an understanding that moments like this do not end when the microphones turn off. They ripple outward, shaping expectations, responsibilities, and the way a nation will be judged in the years to come. At the civil level, the message was unmistakable. The sacrifices made so far by soldiers, by displaced families, by communities slowly rebuilding their lives must lead to results that are visible and lasting. Not symbolic gestures, not short-term relief, but outcomes that ordinary citizens can feel in their daily lives. The return of populations to their villages is only the beginning. Stability must follow. Services must return. A sense of normal life must be restored. Otherwise, the moral contract implied by sacrifice begins to fracture. The general's insistence on visible and perceptible effects was not rhetorical. It reflected an understanding that public patience is not infinite. People can endure hardship when they believe it has meaning. But when progress stalls, faith erodes quietly and dangerously. Politically, the implications are even more profound. By framing the struggle as irreversible, the speech set a clear direction for the state. This is not a temporary phase. It is not an experiment that can be abandoned without cost. The path chosen has already reshaped institutions' priorities and expectations. Turning back now would not restore the past, it would only compound the losses already incurred. This is where leadership becomes a collective responsibility. The general did not present the president as a solitary figure acting above the system. Instead, he emphasized that the weight of governance must be shared. Ministers, commanders, administrators, and civil servants all carry a portion of the outcome. Success or failure will not belong to one name alone. In that sense, the speech subtly redefined loyalty. Loyalty was not described as silence or obedience. It was described as effort, as presence, as the willingness to do more than what is required on paper. Supporting the leadership meant ensuring that decisions translated into action and that action translated into change. This has long-term political consequences. A state that asks for sacrifice must demonstrate competence. A leadership that demands unity must deliver coherence. Otherwise, the narrative of shared struggle collapses under its own weight. The general's words acknowledged this risk without naming it, directly an approach that gave the message credibility rather than defensiveness. Perhaps the most powerful consequence lies in how history will record this period. The speech repeatedly returned to memory, to posterity, to the idea that Burkina Faso will one day look back and ask whether this generation rose to the moment. Whether elders supported youth, whether authority was exercised with responsibility, whether sacrifice was honored with results. In invoking that future judgment, the general placed moral pressure not only on leaders but on society as a whole. This is not a story meant to end with applause. It is a story meant to be continued through policy choices, administrative discipline, and civic engagement. The struggle described is not merely against insecurity, but against the failure to transform sacrifice into progress. At this stage, the figure at the center, Ibrahim Traoré, is portrayed not as an untouchable symbol, but as a catalyst. The real test lies in whether the system surrounding him rises to the level of commitment he has shown. Because if it does not, the consequences will not be abstract. They will be lived. From the outside, moments like this are easy to misread. To international observers, especially those far removed from the realities of the Sahel, a military promotion and a speech of gratitude may appear routine, another internal affair in a distant country. But context changes everything. And when viewed carefully, this moment speaks to questions that extend far beyond Burkina Faso. For much of the world, leadership today is associated with institutions, procedures, and public relations. Sacrifice is discussed but rarely embodied. Risk is managed, not embraced. Responsibility is often distributed so widely that accountability becomes abstract. That is why this speech stands out. It does not ask the international community for approval. It does not appeal to global audiences. Instead, it focuses inward on duty, on generational responsibility, and on the moral cost of decision-making. Ironically, that inward focus is precisely what gives it international relevance. For American viewers, particularly older generations, the themes may feel familiar. They echo an era when leadership was expected to carry personal consequence, when young men were called to serve and elders were expected to guide, not retreat. When national direction was debated, not only in terms of policy, but in terms of character. In the United States, discussions about leadership often revolve around institutions and safeguards, and rightly so. But this story invites a different question. What happens when institutions are fragile and leadership becomes personal by necessity? In that environment, the burden placed on individuals increases dramatically. The speech acknowledges this reality without dramatizing it. It presents leadership not as a privilege, but as exposure to criticism, to risk, and to irreversible personal cost. Globally, this challenges a common narrative about Africa. Too often, African leadership is discussed through the lens of dependency, instability, or external influence. This moment resists that framing. It portrays a nation grappling with its own survival, making hard choices internally, and holding itself accountable to standards that are moral before they are diplomatic. The absence of external references in the speech is telling. There is no appeal to allies, no condemnation of rivals, no attempt to shift responsibility outward. That silence signals confidence, not arrogance, but ownership. It suggests a belief that legitimacy must first be earned at home before it can be recognized abroad. For the world, this raises an uncomfortable comparison. How many leaders today openly acknowledge the personal cost of their decisions? How many invite older generations to take responsibility for supporting younger leadership rather than criticizing it from a distance? The figure at the center of this moment, Ibrahim Traoré, is not presented as a model to be copied universally. His situation is specific, his challenges are local, but the questions raised by his leadership are universal. What does commitment look like when failure carries national consequences? What does unity mean when sacrifice is unevenly distributed? And how should the world respond not with judgment, but with understanding when a country chooses a difficult path because easier ones have already failed? For American audiences watching from afar, this is not merely a story about Burkina Faso. It is a mirror. One that reflects enduring questions about leadership responsibility and the price societies ask their youngest members to pay, and whether the rest of us are willing to stand with them. When speeches like this are delivered, their true impact is rarely immediate. There are no instant results, no measurable applause, no clear line between words and outcomes. Instead, their power lies in what they demand afterward. This closing message is not a celebration of authority, it is a warning about responsibility. It reminds a nation and anyone listening beyond its borders that sacrifice creates an obligation. Once a people accept sacrifice as necessary, they must also accept the harder task of turning it into progress. That is where many movements fail. Not on the battlefield, not in the moment of courage, but in the long, quiet months that follow when discipline fades, unity weakens, and effort becomes optional. The speech we have examined refuses to allow that outcome. It insists that the struggle underway in Burkina Faso is irreversible, not because retreat is impossible, but because retreat would erase meaning from everything already given. From lives disrupted, from youth spent under pressure, from elders who now stand at a crossroads between support and silence. At its core, this is a story about choice. The choice of a young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, to place himself at the center of a national burden rather than above it. The choice of older generations to either protect that sacrifice with action or dilute it with hesitation. And the choice of a society to decide whether unity is a slogan or a practice. The warning is simple but severe. If sacrifice does not produce visible change, it becomes memory without meaning. If leadership is not supported by systems, it becomes exhaustion. And if responsibility is deferred long enough, history records not intentions, but outcomes. This moment in Burkina Faso invites a broader reflection for all of us. In an age when leadership is often distant, procedural, and insulated from consequence, what happens when someone leads from within the storm instead? What does that demand from those who are safer, older, or more comfortable? For American viewers, especially those who have lived through periods of national testing, these questions may feel uncomfortably familiar. They echo debates about duty service and the moral weight of decisions that shape future generations. And that is why this story matters beyond headlines. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it asks the right questions. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet, can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should we support someone else to succeed him? As conversations about Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and Africa news continue to circulate, the deeper issue remains unchanged. Leadership only matters if a people are willing to stand behind it with more than words. Please share this if you feel you are among the first to truly reflect on what sacrifice in leadership means today. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines and that Africa's future deserves careful, honest attention.